everyone. There's a jackhammer next door, so I'm as far away from that door as I can be. Cameron's clear outside. I see. If I were outside, the jackhammer would just be way too loud. Okay, let me pull up the slides. We'll get something close to through the hypobaric, hypoxic stress today. We'll talk about training strategies, what to do, some train low, sleep high, stuff like that. We'll talk about that on Wednesday, but we'll get through pretty much everything else in some level of detail for the hypobaric, hypoxic stuff. You know all of this. You know the what baroreceptors are. You know what chemoreceptors, what we're sensing with these things, where they live, where they send those messages, the cranial nerves that respond, that sense these things. What happens in the medulla, right? If we're inhibiting the sympathetic nervous system, what that would mean. So all of this stuff, the baroreceptor, chemoreceptor stuff, all of that. The vagus nerve, how that works, the heart, how it accelerates and decelerates. Oh, vasodilation, vasoconstriction, what's in the air, ventilation, and respiration. Remember, respiration is more of this metabolic thing of delivering oxygen, delivering carbon dioxide from the tissues, delivering oxygen to those tissues. But ventilation is very mechanical. Ventilation is let's just move bulks of air, right? Let's just that's ventilation, right? But the respiration and the biochemical definition of respiration, we're getting into some more sort of metabolism of how we actually use the oxygen to create ATP. But this is foundational to what we're talking about. The VO2, the better your VO2, the better your performance. The higher your altitude, the worse your VO2. So the higher your altitude, A equals C stuff. The higher your altitude, the worse your performance. But what adaptations are going to arise from that? What adaptations are going to come from exposing yourself to that stress? At the beginning of the semester, we talked about just specificity of adaptation, the breadth of stresses that can be placed on our tissues that can threaten our survival and the health of our cells and organs and whatever. And we're going to respond in the interest of self-preservation. We're going to respond with specificity of adaptation. And so what are the stresses at altitude? Well, we're looking at pressure and the partial pressures in particular of those individual gases. Sometimes we're looking at cold weather. You get up in Everest and there's just snow everywhere. But just remember EPO and the generation of red blood cells. We're going to get all of this oxygen carrying capacity. 99-ish% of the oxygen we're sending through the blood is in the red blood cells. Sure, there's a little bit dissolved in the blood, but most of it's going to be in the red blood cells. If you have a ton of oxygen, your actual performance should be a little bit better because you should be able to maintain your pulse oximetry, your arterial oxygen saturation. And yeah, as a recovery, I don't buy it, but as a performance aid, as an ergogenic aid during the performance, this seems legitimate, and especially as you go up in altitude, when the partial pressure of oxygen starts to fall, performance starts to suffer. In this case, oxygen can save your life. It'll at least save your performance, if not your health. So the ventilatory stuff that's going to change, right? That tidal volume. Remember the Cheyne-Stokes breathing, where It is that crescendo, decrescendo breathing. It's the periodic breathing. You speed up, speed up, speed up, slow down, slow down, slow down, speed up, speed up, speed up. So we're just talking about this tidal volume and how much you're taking in and out, and the rapidity of breaths, the minute ventilation, how many breaths you're taking in every minute. Now remember, as you go up in altitude, the air looks like that. Down in altitude, up in altitude, down in altitude, the partial pressure of air. And that partial pressure determines where that air goes, where the oxygen, how much is absorbed, right? It determines carbon dioxide. Where these gases go is a consequence of their partial pressure. So let's say that one's oxygen and that one's nitrogen or something. Dalton's law would say that's the total pressure, but individual pressures of gases determines individual behaviors, and especially oxygen in the environment, oxygen in the tissues. That is the driving force to mobilize oxygen, to deliver it to the hungry tissues where it's consumed, where it's needed. Now, this is going to come up again today, the oxygen dissociation curve. Remember, as you get really hot, hemoglobin is just releasing its oxygen. As you get colder, it's hanging on to it a little bit tighter. And it's the same thing with the accumulation of carbon dioxide and the falling of pH over here. The Bohr effect, those two are coupled. So as pH falls, meaning you accumulate hydrogen ions, right? As hydrogen ions accumulate, pH falls. And that would be the accumulation of hydrogen ions and carbon dioxide over here. And that is going to come up again. But we maintain. We get to a threshold when we're hiking and we crash, but we maintain pretty effectively for a while. But as we get higher and higher and higher and higher and higher, the amount of oxygen available to us relative to sea level just gets lower and lower and lower. It gets harder and harder and harder to make use of your breaths. Every single breath you take is just a little bit less valuable. It's like every paycheck goes down. You just with every meter you ascend, your monthly wages decrease, and eventually you just can't afford rent anymore. You can't afford food. You can't afford anything. It's very similar in oxygen. As you get higher, your pay grade gets cut and cut and cut and cut. So baria, right? Gas pressures, hyperbaria, hypergas pressure. And hyperoxia would be higher oxygen. Now, if we're at altitude, it's going to be hypos. It's going to be the same thing for baria and oxia, right? It's going to be pressure, and it's going to be the concentration of oxygen, the partial pressure of oxygen, not just the total pressure, gas pressure, whatever, but the concentration of oxygen. So that's going to be your oxias, and hyper as compared to hypo. Now, you remember the work of breathing. If you're down low, you're in the cave, you're underwater, or something like that, ventilation itself takes a little bit more labor. That's the opposite when you're at altitude. When you're at altitude, it's less work to move that. I was going to say invaluable, but that also means valuable for some stupid reason. To move that non-valuable air in and out. The diving response. The fluid balance, right, where the pressures are driving your blood into core circulation, central circulation, and your heart is going. You're going to have a larger stroke volume, right? More preload, more venous return to the heart, a higher stroke volume. And so at that point, what do the atria notice? A high blood volume. So you get atrial natriuretic peptide, giving you a little more P. But so these fluid balances that change, the cold shock response, this thing, barotrauma, this pressure induced trauma, as you go down, as you increase the pressure, you can induce injuries. And the most devastating one, it's not the, ears during flight where you're getting like a vacuum effect. It is holding your breath during ascent, because you kind of seal the chamber, and then that gas expands. The total pressure decreases, the volume increases, and you can have a bunch of lung damage that way. The Benz, right, Henry's law, just like if this is the pop can, right, this is the pop can right here, and you really concentrate some gas, some whatever it is, whatever the gas is, it's argon, it's nitrogen, it's carbon dioxide, it's oxygen, whatever, you're going to increase the amount that's dissolved in here. Now, same thing with all these gases, these concentrated gases you're breathing. You're going to, with all of that pressure, you're going to pressurize them into you, into your blood and into the tissues. And if you ascend too quickly, you if you open that pop can, and that happens, and all those bubbles start coming out of the pop can. They are exiting the whatever, your cola, your soda, or whatever. They're exiting your Dr. Pepper. So you know what, like it's like fizzy and it's exiting. It's not just the bubbles aren't just hanging out in there. They are exiting because Henry's law, because you changed the pressure of that gas, in that case carbon dioxide. You change the pressure of carbon dioxide in the air right above the fluid. And so as you remove that partial pressure, all that gas starts to escape. If you ascend too quickly, it's like opening the pop can. Those gases are escaping, and man, that can be a problem. I mean, you can look like this coming out of there. So that's just all this is saying. And then you get into like nitrogen narcosis, and that's just too much nitrogen accumulating in the brain. People make terrible decisions in that case. The loss of consciousness, remember the ascent, you can't make as much use as you get lower and lower and lower pressure. Your volume of air is expanding. And so the partial pressure of oxygen is being reduced, so you can't absorb as much. So you could have timed, if you hold your breath and you're timing it, like, how long can I hold my breath? And then somebody basically just takes a vacuum to you and says, you thought you could hold it for another 30 seconds? Let me just vacuum everything out of your lungs. Have no air in there. You can hold it for 1 second. This ascent can have an effect similar to that. The hyperventilation, remember, is people and then go down. They're eliminating a bunch of carbon dioxide before the descent, and then that is for those chemoreceptors. That's this major point of acknowledgement to say, we don't need to breathe that much. We don't have that much carbon dioxide in here, but your oxygen is kind of low, and so you confuse the chemoreceptors into thinking you need to breathe less than you actually do. Carbohydrate depletion, who cares about that one? So this becomes this critical variable for, I don't know, performance or survival or health or something during diving, but also it becomes critical for ascent as you go up the Alps, as you go up Everest, as you go up I don't know, Yosemite has a bunch of peaks that are of reasonable height. But as you ascend these things, life lives at different levels. Down here, there's just lots of life. Down here at sea level, like everything lives. And as you go up and up and up and up, about 1,000-meter increments in this case, you're seeing more and more sparse life, but you're seeing life that is equipped, that is biologically, evolutionarily equipped, enzymatically, whatever, equipped to thrive at that particular altitude. Now, a high thriving animal might not be equipped to perform optimally, to function at sea level, or certainly below sea level. But the highest human habitation, that's not up here on the top of Everest, but this was, I Googled this morning, highest human habitation, and this, I don't know, trust it, don't trust it, whatever. I would verify this more than just my words and what Google came up with. But as we ascend, we see different life. Remember bumblebees? I mean, Cameron sitting outside. She probably hears the little symphony of bees around her somewhere. Bumblebees thrive around us, but they're capable of flying at simulated altitudes above Everest, right? They're going to change the biomechanics of their performance and maybe the metabolism a little bit. There are variables that will change, But bumblebees can get up there pretty high and still maintain flight. And the Rupel's, the griffin, this giant vulture, this bird, 37,000 feet, it collided with an airplane. 37,000 feet. That is high up. And apparently it's fine, other than it was chewed up in the airplane and they were able to retain a few bones to identify it. 15 partial feathers from the wings, 5 complete, whatever. There's a couple of bones. But okay, so some life can live up there. We can't. Acute illness will get the bad. I mean, we'll die if you just deposit us up there. No way we are going to survive long. And just remembering that as we increase altitude, VO2 max decreases. As you get up into some of these peaks, these summits, what we're looking at is a third of a standard atmosphere. So what you have now, go outside or wherever you're right now, you're just breathing, cut that by a third. Your availability of oxygen, your ability to make metabolic use of the air you are inspiring, cut that by a third, and you're going to have a hard time walking to the bathroom or to the kitchen or getting out of bed or not having a splitting headache or surviving. Now, people, though, there are people who live at relatively high altitudes. You get that elevation up there, and there are people who live there, but they don't really do well. There's genetic adaptation. They don't do that well going down to sea level. It's not as though they are the world's best marathon runners because they have a lifetime of adaptation to, their hearts and lungs and enzymatic profiles. That's not really how it works. They are environmentally equipped very specifically to the altitude in which they live. And you can say the same thing about the yak, right? The yak is very well studied. But it is an evolutionary adaptation. So at the beginning of this semester, when we talked about accommodation, adaptation, and evolution, genetic adaptation or evolution, that's what we're talking about with the yak, right? That we have this these genes, this adaptive evolution that has allowed the yak to thrive in those high environments. And there's tons of articles. There's a book over here, but this article up here about these species that are able to endure hypoxic environments. And there's a lot that is going on. The hypoxia inducible transcription factors, right? So VEGF, vascular endothelial growth factor, and erythropoietin. So erythropoietin, EPO, right? This is the cycling drug, and every other aerobic drug, where you're going to increase the amount of red blood cells you have. How much hematocrit can you squeeze into that blood? How much hemoglobin can you amass in your gooey gelatinous blood? And then vascular endothelial growth factor, let's get some new roadway here. Let's get even more vascular beds to get this gooey oxygen saturated blood to really deliver this weak ass air, to deliver everything it has, just suck everything out of the air and get it to the tissues. But that it's any factor, right? The protein, a transcription factor. This is studied. Remember, this is studied for people of, all right, how do we, okay, maybe in like the yak, right? There are different isoforms and different concentrations, and you're looking at the kidneys and the heart and lungs, and we're seeing some differences, but it's also studied in people. And a couple of the important things, the angiogenesis, right? Vascular endothelial growth factor and angiogenesis, and then also the metabolism of aligning both the vascular channels, the hematocrits and characteristics of the blood, and the metabolism. Let's align this. Let's calibrate all of that, the cardiovascular stuff. Let's get it well calibrated for altitude, right? So we can go up, 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 and not lose consciousness or, like cognitive function or life or whatever. So as we go down, the pressure increases, increases, increases. By comparison, right, hypoxia and hypobaria, this is just reductions, the hypo, right, just like with the hypers. This is just reductions in those things as opposed to increases. We're just decreasing oxygen. It's the same as we go down and our little balloon is sad and moping and it's like, it needs some, I don't know, like Zoloft or whatever. And then up here, our balloon is super happy and excited, and the posture demonstrates that. But it's the same amount of gas. It's the same amount of gas inside of the balloon. The volume just changes as the pressure changes. And if you take a breath out of this balloon, you don't get much, right? If you take a breath out of this balloon, you sort of deplete the entire thing, and all of the gas, it'd be like how big are your lungs, right? They're not that big. A balloon is huge. And you can't just go and get all that air in there, right? You can't fill your lungs by, like, some people can, in like a single breath, they get the beer clear down. It's like it was like a 3-second drink, and they just like didn't even swallow. It just poured down the trachea, whatever, the esophagus, I guess. But the if you if you're able to breathe all of the air in that balloon, you're going to consume a fair amount of oxygen. It's very compressed air down here. But yet you take like an eighth of that balloon. So you're getting like an eighth of the gas. It should make sense, whatever the imagery. So the control of breathing. What happens as we're breathing? Remember this chain Stokes breathing, where your chemoreceptors notice. You go up at altitude. Your chemoreceptors notice that you're not getting enough oxygen, right? The partial pressure of oxygen in the air you're breathing is low. You don't get as much, and so you're going to accelerate your respiration. Now, when you do that, you expel a great deal of carbon dioxide. You're hyperventilating and you're expiring carbon dioxide just fine. You're just not getting the oxygen in all that effectively. So you exhale, you expire a bunch of carbon dioxide. And in the blood, right, carbon dioxide goes down, right? Your pH changes. Okay, you are going to limit the amount of hydrogen ions in there, because hydrogen ions and carbon dioxide travel in tandem. And so this change in blood, this reduction in hydrogen ions, reduction in carbon dioxide that you have in the blood, is going to trigger the chemoreceptors to speed up your ventilation. So you will end up increasing ventilation. So you just got to go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth as oxygen is depleted, and then you need more and more and more oxygen. You just go back and forth with this stuff. Metabolism changes a great deal if you don't have enough oxygen, right? If you don't have sufficient oxygen, you are going to become much more glycolytic, okay, for a while, but it's much less efficient in terms of the amount of work you can do per calorie consumed. There is a metabolic efficiency that is worse here, and so the higher you go, your performance will suffer. You just can't consume calories. You can't burn through quite as many as you reduce the amount of fat and oxidative metabolism you're using. So today we'll do training strategies next time, but physiological responses as we go up in altitude, there's a bunch of cardiovascular stuff that's going to happen. There's also global things. There's weight loss, stuff like that, but most of this is cardiovascular pulmonary changes, and the cardiovascular stuff is more chronic. The pulmonary stuff tends to be very acute. The cardiovascular tends to be a bit more chronic. The typical illnesses that come up as you get up to, you know, 6,000 feet, 10,000 feet, 15,000 feet. As you start to ascend the mountain, what are the signs and symptoms of complications? And what are the explanations for those complications? What limits peak performance at altitude? Surprisingly little evidence about, comparing different uh, okay, let's take a bunch of runners and let's see exactly which component of performance begins to suffer at these different elevations. You'd think there'd be more research than there is. There's some highlanders and lowlanders, right? So if you are genetically, we are all, well, I don't know, not everybody, but anybody from Stockton or I mean, the Central Valley anywhere, we are definitely lowlanders. And there are some evolutionary differences, some genetic adaptation differences between people born in the Central Valley generation after generation of the biological threats here are, pollens and whatever valley fever. Whereas if somebody is born at the, in Tibet or something, very different. There's no valley fever in Tibet. And so those would be the highlanders, and there are some fundamental differences, just like the yak is different from other its other quadruped companions. And then visiting and residing, if you're going to go to Tibet, what do you expect to happen? What's the time frame of that happening? When you return to California, what is the time frame of retention? How long until those adaptations start to dwindle, until you start to lose them? When you come off the mountain, how long do you retain those benefits if you're an aerobic athlete? If you're an aerobic athlete, they are perks that you can take with you to your sea level marathon. If you're going to go up to altitude for a while and improve your VO2 max, it'll stay with you on the race. That's a ergogenic aid you can take with you on the race for a little while. But most of these adaptations, as you begin exercise, as you begin the ascent, rather, you begin ascending the mountain, most of this stuff, there's just a bunch of cardiovascular responses. Again, acute stuff with the lungs. There's some acute pulmonary changes, but the chronic stuff that starts to set in, in how the heart is responding, not just like, temporary stroke volume changes or heart rate changes or something, but a lot of the actual adaptations that will set in of I don't know, vascular beds and get all that vascular endothelial growth factor and get more dense capillary networks and mitochondrial density, stuff like that. You're getting a little bit out of the heart, but still very aerobic. Now you introduce exercise to this. No longer are you just hanging out in a hammock on the mountainside. Right now, you're actually hiking. You're doing some calisthenics out on the plateau, whatever. Now we have a new set of stressors, and it gets a little bit more complicated, because if the only stress is at rest, how much oxygen needs to be moved through these tissues? Let me regulate my breathing and my heartbeat to try to align it with that need. But if you introduce exercise, you now have specific tissues that are demanding some of that blood flow. And so you get into some local factors for vasodilation, and you get into some endocrine changes. And so exercise just presents some additional stressors. Now, when you're up at altitude, You're gonna lose weight for people who spend any amount of time up there. Edmund Hillary, this is the guy who, along with his Sherpa, who kind of shares the glory, the first group of people who ascended Mount Everest, who reached the peak of Mount Everest. And there was this expedition um, where they were tracking people's body weights. And, pound, 2 pounds, maybe 3 pounds a week people were losing. And there's a lot of explanations of what this is coming from. But remember, there's a lot of glycolytic metabolism going on, a metabolic inefficiency, and a lot of elevated um, breathing I mean, just the mechanics of minute ventilation. Of if you're let's say you double the rate of minute ventilation, that's a lot of muscle work, right? That's calories right there. If all you remember those met values, where if all you do is stand up, you're sitting and then you just stand up, you've doubled your met values and you're just standing there. And so anything that you're adding to your body's normal resting metabolism, all that heart and lung work and the inefficient metabolism, all of this is going to contribute to a net loss of calories. I mean, I guess you could just really eat as much butter as you can and try to keep it on. But people tend to lose weight as they ascend. Now, getting into some of the illnesses, okay, as people ascend, the problem is that people aren't really acclimatized or acclimated if they're doing it in a lab. People have these ambitions of going, and like very little of the earth is actually high, right, with the exception of Antarctica. 2.5% of the world's land mass is above 3,000 meters, and we don't inhabit those regions, and yet there's just crowds of people. I mean, it is like mosh pits of people ascending those mountains. I mean, the pictures sometimes look funny. It's like a Justin Bieber concert or something, and that's like Everest, and people are hiking up, and just tents everywhere. It looks like that fire festival is actually what it looks like: dire tents and horrible living situations and sick people. If you know what I'm talking about, fire festival. That's what it looks like when some of these pictures of Everest, where it's just like sad, helpless people in like rescue tents. Uh, but at these levels, remember, as the altitude goes higher and higher and higher, the partial pressure of oxygen goes lower and lower and lower, and people just don't prepare for that. They just think. I once went deep sea fishing, and I thought I grew up in a house with a pool. I was decent at swimming. I used to swim in the ocean once in a while. It was like 5 degrees because it's an Oregon ocean. And I went deep sea fishing, and my friend Fred, who I went with, he's like, "Do you want some Dramamine?" It was like anti, like let's not vomit. And I'm like, no, no, that's for weak people, right? I come on. I'm Courtney. I can handle a rocky boat. And then I just vomited the entire time. I didn't catch one fish. I just Before I even cast my first line out, they brought out a bucket for me, and I was considering just jumping off the boat and swimming back to sea. So I think with that attitude of I don't need the Dramamine, nausea, nah, that's not going to happen to me. I think people have a similar attitude when it comes to hiking. Like, well, I walk a lot. I jog on the treadmill. I my when I take my dog for a walk, it's always panting and exhausted, and I could go another 3 miles. I mean, people tell themselves stories that like I'm in really good shape. Yeah, but everyone says that sort of about themselves, and altitude is not the type of shape we're talking about. Walking your dog or jogging on a treadmill, that has almost nothing to do with altitude. Specificity of adaptation, we are unprepared as a species to go unless people are sleeping in hypobaric chambers. Okay, fine. Yeah, that person may be, ready to do altitude. But I don't know anybody who has a hypobaric chamber. And so I don't know anybody who's really equipped, who has been training and is actually equipped to go hiking at these high altitudes. And so you look at acute mountain sickness, AMS, acute mountain sickness. There's also chronic mountain sickness, but acute mountain sickness happens to so many people once you reach a certain altitude. Oh, under 3,000 meters, 10%, something like that. But you get up to that like 5,000 meter mark, and you're getting around 50%, about half of people at around 5,000 meters are getting acute mountain sickness. And this is the scoring system: 0 to 3. 0 was like, nope, my head is wonderful. 3 is piercing migraine. I'm seeing like sparkles in the air. But the gastrointestinal, people get really nauseated with this. The fatigue, the weakness, that lethargic feeling, the dizziness, lightheadedness of I stood up too quickly and it didn't go away. And then difficulty sleeping. So these are the major domains of acute mountain sickness, and the things to pay attention to, not to panic about. It's like, oh, am I maybe a little bit nauseated? Let me see if I can, move in a weird way that arouses nausea. I mean, it's not stuff to like panic about, but if you're noticing like, man, just a headache won't go away, and I need to vomit and I can barely take a step. Okay, I think you qualify here. I think we're having an acute mountain sickness problem, or you have like the flu, but depending on your environment, if you're halfway up the mountain, it's probably not the flu that's doing it. So in this same article that we're looking at, here's figure 2. You've seen this before, the oxygen dissociation curve. And as pH falls, right, that means you're getting more acidic, you're more hydrogen ions. When a pH is going down, that means more hydrogen ions are out there, more H's for that P. And then DPG, remember earlier, bisphosphoglycerate, 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate. I said it sometimes listed as DPG, diphosphoglycerate, or bisphosphoglycerate. It's the exact same thing. And then temperature. So if your temperature is increasing, the pH and the hydrogen ions are accumulating, and carbon dioxide is accumulating, and if DPG goes up, you're releasing the oxygen more. So hypoxia, low oxygen concentration, right? The partial pressure of oxygen is low in the air. Minute ventilation is going to increase, right? Because you're noticing that's like, I just don't have enough oxygen in those breaths. And so I need to take more breaths to get the same amount of oxygen. Okay, think about stroke volume of the heart. Each beat doesn't have enough blood in it. I just need to beat some more times. It's the same thing with your breaths, right? So there's not as much oxygen in those breaths that you can extract from those breaths, and so you increase your minute ventilation, and that reduces your carbon dioxide. You continue to expel carbon dioxide as you breathe more and more and more. You hyperventilate. You're expelling a bunch of carbon dioxide. When we do that, you expel carbon dioxide. We're going to increase our pH. We're going to increase the pH. We're going to reduce the amount of hydrogen ions. We're going to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide. We shift the oxygen dissociation curve left. In response, BPG or DPG, diphosphoglycerate or bisphosphoglycerate, is going to increase. Now, this is the thing that you can't get from transfused blood. You're not going to get that from transfused blood. So if you are blood doping, like, I'm a Tour de Everest hiker, and I'm going to blood dope to make my way up the mountain, you're better off just using your own, use an EPO, as opposed to transfusing blood, because the dissociation curve is not going to be mapped onto metabolic need as effectively. So BPG or DPG, same thing, that increases, so you can try to get back to normal a little bit. EPO is going to increase. This is the kidneys regulation over hematocrit. So EPO is going to cause more hematocrit, more red blood cells, more hemoglobin. Let's get the oxygen carrying capacity of this blood. Now, this is a little bit more chronic of an effect. This isn't like, breathe faster this minute, right? This is a little bit it takes a little bit of time to get this going. The heart rate is going to accelerate, right? So total cardiac output. If you can't, just like when you exercise, oxygen's low, heart starts beating faster. Why is the heart beating faster during exercise? Not just because it's like, ooh, it's scary, the exercise is. Your heart is beating faster because you need more oxygen being delivered to those exercising tissues. Now, if you need more oxygen being delivered all over the place, right, the heart rate's going to increase as though you're exercising. It's the same thing. So the heart rate's going to accelerate, and then you'll also retain some more fluids. And this is where it can get a little bit messy. Some of the fluid retention, the cerebral blood flow is going to increase, and you're retaining some extra fluids. Now here, we're going to transition into HAPE and HACE. This tends to follow acute mountain sickness. You get some early signs. Acute mountain sickness, just go down the mountain. Don't push on. Just like when we were talking about heat strokes, right? If your core temperature is, edging, if you're starting to get loopy, don't push through it, right? That analogy I gave about you're driving the car and on the dashboard, the thermometer says like, oh, our little heat warning light is on. Don't keep driving because you only have 80 miles to go. Pull over and let the engine cool down. Otherwise, you can have catastrophic damage. Same thing in the body with heat, right? If you don't pull over and cool your ass down, catastrophic damage can result. With acute mountain sickness, as you go up and you get the equivalent of dashboard lights, you get dashboard warnings. Oh, I'm feeling lethargic and I have a headache and I'm nauseated. Man, like you start getting these things. That's a dashboard light. Go back down. There's no shame in surviving. Dying on the mountain and having future generations hike past you and poke your frozen body with a stick. There's less dignity in that than going back down to base camp. So those are warning signs. And what follows, high altitude pulmonary edema. We all know what edema is, like you see it in the ankles, right? This sort of swelling. HACE, HACE, high altitude cerebral edema. Now, in both of these situations, we're looking at some porous, some leaky vasculature. So fluid retention, HACE, let's start with HACE, the cerebral edema, the brain one. You get swelling around your brain. You might get some hemorrhaging, some micro hemorrhaging. And then there's this vascular permeability, right? This porousness, you're leaking stuff out. And it's the same stuff as acute mountain sickness, but very severe. Yeah, lethargic, fine. Yeah, you're tired. Yeah, you can barely take another step. Yeah, same thing, acute mountain sickness, but the nausea, more severe. The disorientation, this is the real sign of HACE, of high altitude cerebral edema. Your survival depends on it. Your brain is an organ that you would prefer to hang on to for survival's sake. So if it's untreated, you got a couple of days and you're probably going to die. So this is the catastrophic damage of the dashboard lights came on. I didn't pull the car over because I was being macho. Oh, okay. Your brain stopped working. You're getting microhemorrhaging in the brain. Remember, we're increasing. There's a lot of fluid retention, and we're increasing a distribution of blood to the brain across the blood-brain barrier and get all vascularly permeable, and the headaches are going to arise, and nausea is going to rise, sort of classic signals of this. For pulmonary edema, it starts in the same way. The course of these illnesses is the exact same, where low partial pressure of oxygen, but here you end up with pulmonary vasoconstriction, a hypertension, a higher blood pressure, and a pulmonary hypertension. And then you're going to get vascular permeability. Okay, now if stuff, wherever proteins go, water's going to follow. And so earlier this semester, I think we talked about inflammation. And, we have, in response to an injury, even if it's just exercise-induced, micro trauma, where you go do like legs or something, your legs are sore the next day and whatever. Whenever you have disrupted tissue, injured or damaged or otherwise disturbed tissue of some kind, you need to get all of the blood's contents to the site of the injury to put it back together to repair it. Well, how do you do that? You have to make the blood a little bit leaky there, the vessels a little bit leaky. And so there's tons of stuff that's going to contribute to that. Serotonin and vascular endothelial growth factor will do it, and prostaglandins and platelet activating factor. Right? There's all these things that are going to increase the permeability of prostaglandins can go either way, but the permeability of those blood vessels and when those proteins leak out, so that's the inflammatory phase. When those proteins leak out, where those things go, water goes. Water is going to follow the proteins, and so you're going to get swelling. Right, you're going to get this edema. Now, are we in the brain? Are we in the lungs? Where are we? If we're in the alveoli, right, that's high altitude pulmonary edema. Not as critical. The lungs, that they're not as critical as a brain. So just make sure you go back down the mountain, right? Go back down the mountain, take some supplemental oxygen. Let's restore our ability to have oxygen and regular breathing and restore um, circulatory function in the kind of pulmonary circulatory function. So that's HAPE. That's HACE. This is just a table that characterizes these pretty well, right? There's acute mountain sickness, and then the edemas, the cerebral and the pulmonary edema. And those are going to follow that acute mountain sickness. So paying attention to the dashboard lights is a useful attention to retain as you ascend. Again, here there's no gold standard for diagnosis, but there's a bunch of stuff that you're going to get, and the sleeping is often a problem. In almost everybody who's hiking, you're probably not going to sleep all that effectively. So it's not like, well, I got bad sleep, I have acute mountain sickness, or you're hiking and it's uncomfortable and the moon is super bright and you're sleeping on a rock, and if the altitude is unforgiving, and so you're going to sleep shitty. Like that's part of it. But if that is coupled with all of these other complications, or many of these other complications, certainly if you're dizzy or vomiting, or your head is hurting, don't push on, because then you're risking these things. Now, the limitations of performance. It's an important question, because depending on where you play your sport, right? There's an article from 2013 saying the update of understanding. Their conclusion in this article in 2013 of the limitations to performance. If you go to the conclusion section of that article, it's like, yeah, we don't really know. We don't really know in these different altitudes and different sports and different contexts and different populations, what's causing all this. But the best summary is Larry Armstrong book, The Performing in Extreme Environments. And this is essentially what he says, where between 3,000 and 4,600 meters, that's pretty high. That's pretty high up. It's muscle fatigue that you're going to have. The muscles aren't going to perform that well. Remember, you're going to be highly glycolytic. You're not going to be very oxidative. Those muscles, it's not like, oh, I just can't catch my breath. It's just the muscles decide, like, you know what? I don't have the metabolism to do this. If you want the fire to burn, throw some wood in there, right? You're asking me to burn nothing and keep the fire going. And so muscle fatigue tends to be what you see as the limiting variable in performance, below 15,000 feet or so. A little bit over 15,000 feet, and we're seeing differences, depending on the person, depending on the context, depending on preparation, depending on nutrition. Depending on all of these variables, but especially the training. And is this like a Tibetan, or is this a Stocktonian? And what does the training look like? So it's variable. It varies a lot from person to person at that altitude. You go over that, you go over about 20,000 feet, and it's just a good luck breathing. You can't get enough oxygen to the alveoli to supply that. So it's not like, well, my muscle gave out. It's that you just can't do it. And as you get really high in altitude, right, you're nearing the top of Everest. You might have 7 to 10 complete ventilations, like 8, 10 times, and then you can take one step. So you can start to see, is it the muscle fatigue, or is it that it's just like the air? Okay, at that altitude, I mean, certainly, above 20,000 feet, and it's just the air. That it's ventilation, it's cardiovascular, whatever you want to call that as your limiting variable. But the muscle's ability to perform sort of metabolically with its resources, if you're below 15,000 feet, that seems to be the most likely culprit for the limiting variable, and that's trainable, right? Altitude is a trainable, um, threat or stressor. So, visiting, like we're gonna go start training this stuff. Visiting days, maybe weeks, a couple of weeks, 3 weeks, something like that, a month, maybe, whatever. Residence, now we're in the months. We're definitely beyond what you would count in weeks. Oh, how long were you in the, Caribbean? Oh, I was there for 14 weeks or okay, just tell me in months. That's like the baby weight stuff or the age, whatever. How old is your baby? Oh, he's 180 weeks now. Like, what are you? Like, oh, okay. I just say it in years. And it's like a year and a half, whatever. Just round to the nearest half year. Um, and then round to the nearest decade once you hit like 30. um but so months, counting in months for residents. Natives is like, well, my mom's mom immigrated when I was negative 300 years old or whatever. That's natives, and there's going to be some genetic differences here. Now there's going to be some much more chronic adaptation that you'll see here. You can start to see with residents, if you've been there for, you know, 16 months, right? Baby ages. If you've been there for a long time, then you have ample time to increase capillary density. Stuff like that. Blood volume, you're going to change that on the days, right? So the Highlanders and the Lowlanders. We have us, let's just say everybody is a Stocktonian. It's not true. But let's just say everybody here is a Stocktonian. And then we have our high altitude natives. We have our Tibetans and stuff. So those high folks and the low folks, the similar exercise economy, surprisingly, at a given workload. Because what you would expect is there to be a better exercise economy in the lowlanders, given that it's not all glycolytic, right? It's not just a bunch of glycolytic metabolism. You have access to the full air, to the full-bodied air. But at the native altitudes, right? So the highlanders at their altitude, the lowlanders at their altitude, exercise economy is pretty much the same. It's fascinating. You wouldn't expect to see that. And maybe there are differences now and again, depending on the training, depending on the population you look at, right? But in general, the exercise economy is similar. Body composition is going to be similar, and that's a little bit less surprising. But whenever you are manipulating metabolic enzymatic profiles, glycolytic enzymes and aerobic enzymes and whatever, this is going to have a larger effect than just ATP reconstitution or something. But you don't really see those differences manifesting in body composition, nor, again, more surprisingly, in exercise economy. What you see in terms of the differences for those highlanders, those high altitude natives, is larger hearts with more cardiac muscle mass. So there tend to be in these generation populations cardiovascular differences, something you could pick up. Just go give them an MRI or a CAT scan or something, and you could pick up these dimensions of the heart that are a little bit different. Circulatory differences, they have to have that circulatory road work to be able to deliver weak air more effectively. And then the concentration of hemoglobin is going to be higher in their blood. So the blood is going to be a little bit different, the hematocrit and the hemoglobin concentration. The heart itself is going to be a little bit different. And the vascular channels are going to be more extensive in the highland, high altitude natives. Now, if you go visit, you're a Stocktonian, you're a lowlander, and you want to go hang with the mountain folk. The best time to do that seems to be during, go there when you're like a kid, you're about to hit puberty and you want to go expose your tissues to some stress. That's a good time to go. During puberty, you do see some, it's not all, don't take this to mean like, oh, I missed my chance, but there does seem to be somewhat robust optimization of oxygen kinetics, of your body's ability to tolerate higher altitudes as you go through puberty and around that time. So that's a good time to if you like have a kid and you want your kid to be able to run the Tibetan marathon when that's a thing, maybe expose him or her early. And then when a lowlander, right, when one of us low folk become a resident, there are some initial changes. We talked about this at the beginning of today. There are some initial changes to the resting heart rate and stroke volume and cardiovascular responses, all stuff that is aimed at optimization, at acute optimization. But acute and chronic, there's going to be a little bit of a difference. If you get up there pretty high, right? A lowlander gets up to 6,000 meters or so. That's pretty high. The basal metabolic rate is going to increase quite a bit. Now, some of this is going to be thyroxine. Your thyroid, there's triiodothyronine and thyroxine. Those are the two thyroid hormone, T3, T4. Those are those two. And in part, this elevation in metabolism is going to be determined by the thyroid, or at least led by the thyroid, but also, just this work on your cardiopulmonary system, this ongoing participation, this energetic participation of breathing and oxygen delivery costs calories, right? So your metabolism is going to increase. And then stress response, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. As you go up in altitude, you can expect your cortisol levels to be elevated for a while. It's not going to be permanent. That's not a thing that just, well, for every 1,000 feet I go up, I just have more cortisol, right? But there is a response. There's an initial almost in support of Cellier, right? A general adaptation syndrome of stress response over the generalities of altitude stress. Let's get a little bit of cortisol going. Or at least general alarm reaction kind of response that can last a week or so, something like that. Now, the adaptations, as you acclimatize, remember that's out in nature. Acclimate would be you're doing it in a lab in a hypobaric chamber. Acclimatize, you're actually out there on the slopes. The stuff that you would expect, the chemoreceptors in your carotids, remember, so there's the aortic and carotid, and there's some other ones, the kidneys and stuff, but you become more sensitive to hypoxia, and you're going to be able to regulate your ventilation a little bit more effectively with those chemoreceptors. There's a greater sensitivity. Red blood cell production, it doesn't take long, right? For the red blood cell production to begin, you just go up there and the kidneys, squirt out some EPO and you're making more red blood cells, and that's like on day one. So pretty quickly, you're going to start that process. The total blood volume might not increase much, but your relative, the hematocrit, right, the oxygen carrying part of it, is going to definitely increase, and eventually the total blood volume will increase. Now, again, if you're like exercising up there, total blood volume can increase too. It sort of depends on the input of stressors. It depends on on your behavior, on the inputs. Hemoglobin, let's just make as much hemoglobin as we can, right? What is the threat? What is the stressor? What is putting us at risk of illness? Well, lack of oxygen. Okay, what carries the oxygen? Hemoglobin. Let's make some, right? It seems a reasonable decision for the body to make. Myoglobin, that's like the hemoglobin in the muscle. Let's carry some oxygen there. So you're going to get some of that too. Just like you get more hemoglobin, you get more myoglobin. The muscle cross-sectional area is likely to decrease. It's hard to preserve your muscle mass. Remember at the beginning, Edmund Hillary said, like, he went on this expedition and they were tracking body weights, and the publication came out and said you were losing a pound to 3 pounds a week. This is like this is pretty rapid weight loss. Muscle cross-sectional area, meaning total muscle mass, right? That's one of the things that starts to depart. If you think about, without even increasing hemoglobin, myoglobin, capillary beds, without increasing any of that, if you shrink the muscle a little bit, the oxygen is going to work better there, right? You're going to be able to deliver the same amount of oxygen to even less tissue. So there's a oxidative efficiency to a reduction in cross-sectional area. And then the enzyme profiles are going to change. No matter what you're doing, this is a pretty rapid change. Like blood volume, enzymatic changes occur readily depending on your stresses. I mean, what did you do yesterday? What did you do today? What did you do maybe 2 days ago? These oxidative and anaerobic enzymes are constantly changing their profiles. So very generally, the stuff that you would expect, is hemoglobin and mitochondrial density in skeletal muscle, especially if you're reducing the cross-sectional area, you're increasing the density of mitochondria relative to the mass. VEGF, vascular endothelial growth factor. Let's get some more. It's going to make your vasculature a little porous, but remember, this is going to sort of grow your vessels in the direction of need. Wherever these metabolically active tissues are that are hungry for oxygen, all right, let's like throw some roadway over there. So that's the VEGF stuff. Capillary to muscle fiber ratio and capillary vasculogenesis. So these things are sort of describing the same phenomenon where a little bit less cross-sectional area, and if you're getting more, VEGF and kind of capillary beds, that ratio of vascularity to skeletal muscle is more optimal for aerobic metabolism. Myoglobin, VO2 max, and performance. Okay, all of those things, obviously, the performance part. Now, there is an altitude above which, and there's individuality here. It's not as though every single person, there's a foot that you reach, a meter that you reach, a cubit, whatever, that you reach, in which above this point, I am not seeing adaptations that can enhance my performance. I am not seeing positive change here. But there's a range above which we just sort of deteriorate. It's not really an effective training environment to be up too high. So it's somewhere around 5,200 meters or so, something like that, 17,000 feet, whatever. You can't, if you're aiming for adaptation, for positive adaptation, if you're like going up the mountain to become a better, sulfur X, swimmer, runner, cyclist, whatever, that's not the kind of altitude you want to expose yourself to. Timing of things, just general timings, all of this like super depends. Super depends on how much exercise is being involved and what the altitude is, what the stress profile is, how hard you're working. It depends on the history of training. All of this like super depends on things. But glycogen, you can store more after very few workouts. Blood volume can start to expand pretty rapidly. Remember, you can start getting more red blood cells like on like day one. Mitochondrial density might take a little while. Capillaries, that takes quite a while. So if you're just visiting somewhere, if all you're doing is like, oh, I'm going to go to um, Denver and I'm going to run the Denver Marathon, whatever. Okay, if you want to really get as much adaptation as you can. Remember, for the heat stuff, it's relatively complete in short time. Just go like 2 weeks. If it's like, oh, I'm going to run somewhere hot, okay, well, you're never going to be perfectly fit for that environment. So just go a couple weeks ahead of time, and in gradations, expose yourself to a bunch of stress. But for altitude, you can have a very comprehensive adaptation, but it's going to take a long time. So I don't just go 2 weeks ahead of time. Although if you do a couple of weeks ahead of time, then you can get pretty robust changes, but you're not going to get like capillary bed density and stuff like that. Now the loss, it can decrease. It can decrease the red blood cell volume. That's the thing that begins to arrive right away. It's like, all right, here's something that the body can do that's going to enhance your ability to survive and potentially even thrive in this environment. But it starts to go away pretty quickly. 10 days or so, you can see decreases. The work that, you come off the mountain, and how long can you maintain an elevated workload, an elevated aerobic workload? It depends. A few weeks, maybe. There could be, some function, some cardiovascular function that could last for months. Some measurable responses can linger for quite some time, but the performance, maybe a few weeks. There's a lot of research into this. An old friend of mine, Garrett Ash, looked into this. I think published a couple of papers on it, collaborated on it, at least a couple of papers on it, and it depends on what your outcome variable is. How are you measuring this? What is the variable of interest? Is it VO2 max? Is it hematocrit? Is it time in some 10K or whatever? It sort of depends. But there are ranges. You're not going to come off the mountain and on day one you suck, right? You're going to have some weeks there where you get to perform with the benefits of altitude while breathing more compressed air. So the ups and the downs, right? You go up in altitude, the partial pressure of those metabolic gases, right? They're going to get more sparse and sparse and sparse. The partial pressure reduces. Every breath of that air gives you a little bit less bang for the whatever, for the gas, bang for the breath. And as you go down, the partial pressure of the gases, the partial pressure of, in particular, the metabolic gases, although the inert gases can affect you too, for like nitrogen narcosis, stuff like that. But you increase the pressure of those gases and you can make more out of every breath. All right. That is it for altitude physiology. We'll talk a little bit about training on Wednesday, some ideas about how to train, and then we'll do, up in the sky. We'll do, outer space stuff. Questions for today? All right, go. It's sunny out. Go enjoy that. And they stopped jackhammering. So I have a little bit of, they jackhammered for like 8 hours today at my neighbor's house. Okay, I'm gonna go eat and whatever and be done. All right, I'll see you guys. Thanks for the thumbs up, Ricky.